Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Iri and I'm going to be talking to you today about progressive enhancement and CSS. So just a bit of an introduction to myself. Oops. So this is actually my full name. My full name is Iriolua Akonke Elizabeth Oluwashore Aderinokun. So that's pretty typical of where I'm from for many aunts and uncles to give you many different names. But don't worry, you don't have to remember all of that because I typically just go by Ire. Or if you're adventurous and want to be my friend, you can call me Ray. So I'm from Lagos, Nigeria, and this is actually my first time in Zurich, so pretty excited to be here. It's very different between here and Nigeria, and not least like the weather. So this is the last time I'm going to put my face on an image. But this is kind of like me, particularly yesterday when we were walking around going to the speaker's dinner. I was just like, I'm cold. So I'm a user interface designer and front-end developer. I currently work at a media company in Nigeria, which is called Big Cabal. I also write weekly articles on my blog, which is called Bits of Code, so definitely go and check that out. And I just write articles about anything to do with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I kind of like to think of myself as someone who can really break down complicated topics in a way that people can easily understand. So I'm also a Google expert in web technologies, which is just a program that Google has that's like a network of developers and other experts in different fields who go around and kind of like give talks and try and give out their knowledge as well. So the talk today I'm going to do is about progressive enhancement, but not really progressive enhancement as you might have typically heard about it. So it's going to be about progressive enhancement and CSS, which is like, oh my God, groundbreaking. So first of all, what is progressive enhancement? And to really understand what progressive enhancement is, we have to go back to its origins all the way in 2003. And that was kind of a bit of an interesting year. This was actually the most popular phone at the time, which is Nokia 1100, which is kind of crazy to see how phones have gone so far. And, okay, this doesn't work, but this was the sound of the internet. So anyone who had dial-up internet probably recognizes this sound. And this was the state of the web, essentially. So there weren't very many browsers. There was only... Oh, that was the only part, so it's fine. Yeah. So this was the state of the web. So there weren't very many browsers at all. Safari was just in version 1.0. And Phoenix, which is now called Firefox, that's what it was before. And Internet Explorer was completely winning at the browser wars with over 95% market share. So apart from the fact that there weren't many different browsers available, each browser was still in its own infancy. So there was only about a handful of versions of each browser. So it's not like you had to deal with a million different browsers and then a million different versions of each of those browsers. So the prevailing practice at the time was then something called graceful degradation. And this is essentially the practice of building your web functionality so that it provides a certain level of user experience in more modern browsers. So that would be like the most optimum experience where users can do pretty much everything on your site. But then it will also sort of degrade gracefully to a lower level of user experience in older browsers. So people in these older browsers will have like a very limited experience and functionality and ability to access the functionality in the site. So this is kind of an example of graceful degradation, probably done poorly, but still graceful degradation. So someone visits your site and they don't have JavaScript, and you just send them a message saying, well, your browser sucks, like go get Chrome. But then a turning point came on March 11th, 2003. And this was a turning point not unlike Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. But instead of Moses and the 10 Commandments, we had this guy called Stephen Champion, and he brought us progressive enhancement. So he gave a talk at South by Southwest, and in this talk, he first outlined what the major problems were with graceful degradation. So first he said that it doesn't straddle technology inflection points well. So graceful degradation is really just a solution for whatever is the current best browser. So it doesn't really think about what could be in the future or what was in the past. And another problem he noted was that many designers don't even really test for anything but one version back. So graceful degradation wouldn't really be a problem if people were testing like many, many more versions back. But if all you're doing is testing the current and one version back, then that becomes a problem. He also said that graceful degradation doesn't address the different needs of different audiences. So it's only about, like I said, highlighting what's good for the person who's using like the latest version of Chrome, for example. But it doesn't really take into consideration people who are even using that browser, but maybe they have like special needs or special disabilities. It's also expensive to retrofit to new alternate devices. So apart from only being able to work with, let's say, like the latest version of Chrome, it doesn't look at like latest devices or latest browsers that aren't necessarily like fitting with the norms. So it might be something that came out today, but it's just kind of like not the usual type of browser. And finally, it kind of gave the practice of whatever is good enough is just usually rule. So it doesn't really encourage us as designers or developers to think outside the box and think about people who are not in the 99% when we're building things. So then he introduced the concept of progressive enhancement. And what he said was that web design needs to be more mature and accept the developments of the past several years. So we can't just look at what is happening currently. We have to accept what has come before and not just forget about it. And he also reminded us that the goal of web design isn't just to dazzle the user, it's to also deliver information. So if someone is going to your site, let's say it's like a news site or something, they're going there to read the news. They're not going there to look at how beautiful the site is, even if it is. Okay, so all of this is pretty theoretical, but what does this actually mean in practice? So what exactly is progressive enhancement? So I'm just going to go over some 5 guidelines for what progressive enhancement is. So first, we need to make sure that basic content and functionality of your site should be accessible to all web browsers. So you have to think of whatever it is like the core of your site, and just make sure that that is accessible to anyone using any browser. So here's like an example of a site, which is like a site where you can go to find clinics around you. So the user goes to the site and enters in their postcode or their location, and then they'll get a list of clinics that are around them and information. So those are 2 things that users in any browser on any network should always be able to do. So a second rule is that sparse semantic markup should contain all the content. And this involves sort of 2 things. So first of all, the semantic markup. So when we're writing our HTML, we need to make sure to be as semantic as possible and use the correct elements for what we're trying to convey. So you can see that I've used like the actual header elements to display a header, and then actual footer element to display a footer. And then the second part to that is that as much of the content as possible should be defined in plain text in the markup, because this is ultimately the most accessible format for everyone. So the third rule is that enhanced layout can be provided by CSS style sheets. And the key word here is the enhanced layout. So what you're saying is that the page should still be functional without CSS at all, and CSS is just an enhancement. So this is an example of what that clinic site looks like without any CSS. And obviously it's not like it looks pretty or anything, but as long as the content is there and it still makes sense and it's still functional, if someone actually had to use it in this way. The fourth rule is that enhanced behavior can be provided by unobtrusive JavaScript. And again, the key word here is the enhanced behavior, so that the core behavior, the core functionality is available without JavaScript, and then you just add JavaScript as an enhancement. So for example, this is how the search would work without any JavaScript. So the user will just type in their postcode by hand and then click search. They'll go to a different page where they see their results of the form. But if the user does have JavaScript enabled, then you can add this enhancement, which will allow them to just click a button and use their current location. So finally, we need to make sure that the end user web browser preferences are respected. So ultimately, the user who's using their site needs to be in control of how they want to experience the site or experience any other sites. And we have to be careful when we're writing our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to make sure that we're not interfering with that and taking that control away from them. So this is kind of an example of something that you might have seen, and it's really bad practice to add things like user scalable is no for the meta viewport tag, because that just takes the control or the decision away from the user, who might need to like zoom in or zoom out to make their experience more comfortable. So why is progressive enhancement still important today? So obviously the world is very different today than it was back in 2003. So there's just more of everything if we think about it. So first of all, there's many different more browsers. So even though Chrome is dominating as the most widely used browser, it's not nearly as much of the market share as Internet Explorer had back in the day. So there's still a significant amount of other browsers that we need to take into consideration. And apart from that, each browser has many, many more versions. So we're not just dealing with a handful of versions for each browser. So even if your user is on Chrome, well, like which version of Chrome are they using? They might still be on Chrome version like 20 or something for all you know. And there's many more technologies that we're using to develop, and many of these technologies require many more things. So we're not just developing with very simple like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript anymore. And there's significantly more people that are now online. So compared to 2003, the amount of people online has like almost quadrupled. And even if, let's say, 1% of the users now have some sort of like special need, that's still in the millions, and it's not something that can be ignored. And on top of all that, the web is still open and it's still for everyone. So this is a study done by McKinsey and Company back in 2014, and they they looked into how many hours of work that people in different countries have to work to be able to buy and use 500 megabytes of data. And as you can see, like where I'm from in Nigeria, the vast majority of people, or the average person, will have to work like something like 28 hours just to be able to use 500 megabytes of data, as compared to someone maybe in Germany or here would have to work just like 1 hour or so. And because of this, the way that we choose to build our sites actually matters. So even if we might think that adding one giant, like a completely giant style sheet, or adding lots of JavaScript and things that aren't really that necessary to the core experience, even if we think that's not that important, to someone who is having to spend like 28 hours of their time to go and look at your sites, that is really, really important. And Bruce Lawson reminded us that www doesn't stand for like wealthy Western web. It actually stands for World Wide Web. So it's not good enough to build the site and only and make it only accessible to like 1% of people. So now I'm going to go into how progressive enhancement works. And first, I'm just going to go over progressive enhancement and JavaScript and HTML to be able to compare it to how it will work with CSS. So first of all, progressive enhancement and JavaScript, which is probably what you're more used to when we hear the term progressive enhancement. So what can go wrong with JavaScript? And they're basically, broadly speaking, two things. First of all, maybe a case where JavaScript is not enabled in the browser, or the user might be using a browser like Opera Mini where JavaScript is essentially unavailable. Or maybe JavaScript is available, but whatever feature you're using isn't supported by the browser that your user is using. So how do we deal with this? First of all, as I've said before, the first thing that you should always do is try and make your site as functional as possible if JavaScript is not available at all. And that's just kind of like the ultimate progressive enhancement. So no matter what, at least your core functionality is going to be available. Another thing we can do if JavaScript is available is before we use any particular feature, especially the more cutting edge ones, that we do feature support. So we just check to see if it's available before we use it. So for example, if we're making like a progressive web application and we're using the service worker, the first thing they always tell you to do is to check to see if it's available before you start using it. And that way, it's not going to break for browsers that don't support it. And we can even take this further and polyfill our own features. So if, for example, a browser doesn't support native promises, we can just add that functionality ourselves with a polyfill. So that's pretty simple enough, progressive enhancement with JavaScript. So next with HTML. So what can go wrong here is, let's say we want to use some of the new HTML5 elements, but the browser doesn't support it. So what happens there? So for example, we write something like this. We're using the header element and the main element. But if the browser doesn't understand it, it's essentially as if you had just written a plain div. So none of the semantic meaning that we intended to convey by using like header element or main element is actually conveyed. And if we think about it, this is kind of like the graceful degradation approach. So nothing really breaks, things are still functional, but the browser isn't getting the extra information that we want to. And this isn't terrible, but we can actually make it better by using progressive enhancement. So in this case, we can use ARIA rules to add that extra information. So for browsers that don't understand what header or what main means, they'll get that same information from the ARIA rules that we've applied. So again, simple enough. So now to the actual question, well, what about CSS? So there's a bit of a problem with progressive enhancement and CSS. And to understand this, let's just go into how CSS works and what happens when things break. So as we know, CSS is a declarative language for describing presentation of a document written in markup language. So this is how a typical CSS rule is. We have the selector, which is how we select the elements in the markup. Then we have the property, which is the CSS property we want to apply. And then finally the value, which is the value that corresponds to that property. So what happens if something goes wrong? So we have this example here. This is a lovely picture of Kanye laughing out loud. And what we want to do is just turning around 180 degrees. So here's an example of what happens if we have a faulty selector. So instead of doing IMG, I wrote image fully, and we can see that nothing happens. And then here we have a faulty property. Instead of using the transform property, I wrote transformer, and then again, nothing happens. And then finally, a faulty value. Instead of writing 90 DEG, I wrote degrees out in full. Again, nothing happens. And even if we get all of that stuff right, this is the result that we get in a browser that doesn't even support transforms at all. So nothing happens. We don't get any error messages like we might do in JavaScript. There's nothing breaking. And we don't have any like inbuilt fallbacks or anything like that. Just nothing happens. So why is this a problem? So unlike JavaScript, we can't really prepare for unsupported features in the same way as like polyfilling. We can't go like, if this isn't supported, then add this polyfill so we can still have the same functionality. And unlike HTML, there's no sort of built-in fallback the way it works in markup. So that kind of leaves us in a situation where we don't really understand what might be breaking, and when we change things, things just go unexpected, and that's why people tend to think debugging CSS is such a pain. But there are things that we can do to help the situation. So first, I'm going to go over some of the solutions we can use today and for the past few years for progressive enhancement and CSS. So the number one thing I always say is to start with sensible HTML. So as we mentioned before, markup is the core. It's where the content is, so it's ultimately the most important thing. So when you're writing your markup, try to make things as semantic and as orderly as possible. So write your markup in the way that makes the most sense. So don't do something like this where you put your header all the way down and then use CSS to now correct it to make it make more sense. You should just put things in your markup the way they should be, and you can still reorder things in CSS, but put them in the most logical order in your markup. And then this Illust Apart article, this guy called Aderinokun, I think, talked about what he called the progressive enhancement M&M. And he talked about how the HTML is the core, so it's the actual nut, and is the most important part. And everything else you add on top of that is just like an extra enhancement. It's not crucial to the actual M&M. So another thing we can do is take advantage of the cascade. So as we know, CSS is cascading style sheets. And we can use this behavior to our advantage by building rules on top of each other and making each rule kind of like a progressive enhancement on top of the other. So for example, if you wanted to use gradients, we would define them later on and then have some fallback styles defined earlier, so that if the browser doesn't understand this linear gradient function, there's something that they can fall back on. And that's also how we use vendor prefixes. So we always put the unprefixed version at the very bottom. So when the browser now supports the unprefixed version, that's what's being used. And then you put the fallback styles, the ones that are for browsers that don't support like the full unprefixed version. We put that before so that it's only when the browser doesn't understand the latest one that they can now fall back to the previous ones. Another thing we can do is implement a mobile-first strategy when we're writing our CSS. There are many, many benefits to adopting like a mobile-first strategy, and using min-width-based media queries are the best way to go about it. And the reason for this is because styles that you write for mobile are typically way more adaptable to the desktop than the other way around. So for example, here, if you have like an image that you style correctly for the desktop, it's not going to work that well on mobile. Whereas if you have a style that's for mobile, it will at least be workable on desktop. So that's why we try to start from the smaller screen size, which are also typically more responsive sizes anyway, and then work our way up. So an example of this is just, if we had a width on mobile, we'll typically just have it like as a percentage style, maybe 100%. But then as you have a bigger screen size, then you can start to work with more fixed units. Another thing we can do is use Flexbox. So Flexbox was actually designed to be a progressive enhancement, and it has a lot of features that allow us to work with it as an enhancement and have things fall back. So if Flexbox is supported, it will actually override a lot of styles that you have already included. So for example, this selector is trying to center both vertically and horizontally any children within it. So the display table cell and the vertical align middle, that's what would work if the browser doesn't support Flexbox. But if the browser does support Flexbox, then those styles will be completely overridden. Even the vertical align will also be overridden, even though we haven't set a new thing. So Flexbox will actually take control of your layout, and that way you can have the Flexbox styles, and if it doesn't work, you can still have other styles defined, and it won't actually interfere with anything if Flexbox is supported. And Flexbox is very well supported, actually, so you can and should be using it in production at the moment. So another thing you could consider doing is separating your style sheets. So I would say as a very last resort, if you have to support something as far back as like IE 7 or something, it might just make sense to have like separate your concerns and have like a separate thing just for that browser. So the BBC wrote about how they did this a few years ago when the method that they called cutting the mustard. So what they did was they started with a core experience that would work in pretty much any browser. And then they now built on top of that and started doing feature detection to see if the browser supports certain features, then you can start adding some extra things on top of it. So this is kind of the way they did it. So checking for specific features that the browser has, and if it has those features, then they now start loading extra style sheets or extra script files. So now I'm going to talk about the future of progressive enhancement and CSS. So I'm sure by now you're probably wondering, like, what about the latest thing, which is feature queries? So feature queries allow us as the authors to condition rules based on whether a particular property declarations are supported by the current browser. So the way it currently works is sort of like media queries. So we use the @supports rule, and then we have a condition, and then we now have styles that will only be applied if that condition is true. So there are 4 ways that we can use this. So first, we can just do a simple detection to see if a feature is supported at all. So for example, here we have if supports display flex, then we now just apply it to that selector. We can also chain feature queries together in a way, so we can detect if all of several features are supported. So we might only want to apply certain styles if both the font kerning and font feature settings properties are available. And we can do it the other way around, like do either or. So this way we can detect if maybe the prefixed or the unprefixed version is supported before we now apply some styles. And finally, we can also just check if a feature is not supported and maybe try and apply a fallback style instead. So yeah, it's pretty perfect. It seems like a really, truly perfect feature, and it kind of is. And it's very, very well supported, actually. And very recently, it was only added to Opera Mini. And so actually, the only browser that doesn't support it right now is Internet Explorer. So the fact that it's not supported by every single browser doesn't mean that we can't use it today. We can still use it. And there are different methods that we can use. And Jen Simmons wrote an article about how we can use them today, even with browsers that don't necessarily support it. So we're going to take this example. So we want to apply the object fit cover style to our images. And what we want to do is check to see if object fit cover is supported and then apply it. So there are 4 scenarios that we have here. So the first scenario is, let's say the browser does support feature queries and it also supports the CSS feature in question, which is object fit cover. So for example, Chrome, which is a browser that does support both those things. So this is a scenario that's good for us because yes, the browser supports feature queries. It also supports the feature in question. So the styles in between the curly braces for the supports tag will be applied, which is exactly what we want. A second case is where the browser supports feature queries, but it doesn't support the feature in question. So for example, Microsoft Edge does support feature queries, but it doesn't support the object fit cover property. And this is also a scenario which is good for us because then the supports block works as intended. What is between the blocks is going to be ignored because the browser, which understands the supports query, will look at it and say, okay, well, it doesn't support object fit cover, so it's just going to ignore. A third situation is a case where the browser doesn't support feature queries, but then they also don't support object fit cover. So this is Internet Explorer, for example, doesn't support either of those things. And this you might think is not a scenario we would want, but in this case, it actually works perfectly because that Internet Explorer doesn't support object fit cover, what we want is for that entire block to be ignored. And because the browser doesn't support the feature queries, it is ignored. So we have the result that we want, even though the browser doesn't support the feature queries. But then we get to the situation which is bad for us because the browser doesn't support feature queries, but then the browser does support the feature in question. So for example, Safari, I think it's 7.1, does support feature queries, but it doesn't support object fit cover. So this is a scenario where what is within the feature query should actually be applied, but it isn't because the browser doesn't support feature queries. So you might think this is a horrible problem and we can never use feature queries again, but of course there's a solution. And I'm sure you can guess what I'm about to say. It's progressive enhancement. So the answer to this is just to use feature queries as a progressive enhancement rather than a requirement. So we'll have a fallback code above, which can be used by any browser. So it'll be outside the supports block. And so no matter what, if the browser doesn't support either supports or it doesn't support the actual object fit cover, we have something that's going to work for any browser. And then we can have it as an enhancement. So now check if it's available and then apply it. So the world is only moving to a place where progressive enhancement is going to become more and more of a requirement and more rather than less of a requirement. So like I said, there's just going to be more things in general. So we're going to have many more browsers, and it's going to be a greater range than we've ever even thought. So ranging from people using like a huge VR display as a browser to people trying to browse your website on their watch. And we're going to have many more technologies. By that point, we might have Angular 123, whatever. And we're going to have many more people online as well. And those people aren't all going to be coming online with like whatever the latest iPhone is. Some of them might be coming online with the equivalent of the Nokia 1100 that it is today. So lastly, I'd just like to leave us with this quote from Stephen Champion. So the web, as we know, is meant to be open and accepting of anyone who can connect to the internet and has a web browser. So as much as possible, we should be considerate about how we write our CSS and HTML and JavaScript as well, and leave no one behind. Thank you. Questions?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. How to collaborate with other CS developer that the code that we create and reusable, maintainable.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
When we coding about CSS, how to collaborate with others developer CSS.
Okay, so how do you collaborate with other
CSS developer?
Yeah. Well, CSS is quite difficult. It can be quite difficult to collaborate with other people because it tends to be something that you're thinking about in your mind how you want to achieve certain things. But it's just about, I guess, communication and deciding along with your teammates before you start a project, like how are you going to do this or what approaches you're going to take. So it's just about the initial communication so everyone knows the way that the project is going to be written before you move forward. Any other questions?
We have time, so
Yeah.
you can ask. What do you want?
Oh, he has a question.
Thanks a lot for the talk. It was really great.
Thank you.
I was wondering, in this support query, can you also use the not selector there or something so that we can have exclusive styles for if a feature is supported or not?
Yeah, you can use the not as well, but you have to be careful about how you use it in case you get into a situation where the browser doesn't support feature queries, but then it does support the thing. So, but then again, like I said, it's if you provide a good fallback. But yeah, you can use not as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
I wonder, I think it's not a problem, but I wonder if it is a problem potentially. Can you use CSS variables inside support queries and then basically have the same kind of scope, have a different value for a certain CSS variable within the support query?
Yeah, I think you can actually, because when you're setting a variable, it's usually in the root, or if you want it to be anyway. So you can have it outside, like your root variables, and then inside a support query, have another root. Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. I didn't think about that. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Okay.
Since we have time, I was wondering, you showed some examples with the with fallbacks and with different browsers. How would you recommend going about testing all of these different cases that we've been talking about, the different situations with all of the different browsers? How can we even make sure that what we wrote actually is progressive for the different cases, for the different browsers?
The only thing you can actually do is get the different browsers or different devices, or that's the best thing you can do. You can try, I know in Chrome DevTools you can emulate different browsers and try things like that. But the best solution is going to be to actually just have different devices you can test on and have the different browsers as well. Which I know is difficult, but what?
Manual testing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, there's stuff like, I can't remember what the tool is, Browserify or something. But if you Google, there are some tools that will try and do that for you and take screenshots. Yeah. Yeah, you can try that as well. Yeah. Any more questions?
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
So my question is, now we have different possibilities to do this progressive enhancement. First of all, we have the possibility to do something in CSS, but you could also do it in JavaScript. And more or less, if you do responsive websites, you have to do hacks on both sides. So what are your recommendations? So try everything you can do with CSS and go further with JavaScript, or what's the idea to mix these things up into both?
I guess it depends on what particular things you're talking about. I would say, well, like that article talked about how like you have the progressive enhancement, M&M. So if you start with HTML, then the next thing you should try and do is CSS. And then it's only if you can't use, or if CSS is not enough, then you do JavaScript. So I guess I would say as much as possible, try and do CSS. But then that would also depend on what you're trying to do, because you shouldn't try and be doing like logic things in CSS anyway. So yeah, they're just different things, and you have to apply progressive enhancement to both of them. Okay, thank you.